We have it in place quite firmly in most of the states at 6, 7, and at 9, 10. So if we're going to do it, we've got this wonderful opportunity. Let's do it well. Let's give our students a real sense of the world, because this is probably the only place many of them are going to get it. They're not going on to history studies or graduate studies in any field of history or social science. They're going to be, plumbers, doctors, auto mechanics, dentists and whatever. And increasingly higher education is focusing on, getting right into your field and doing it. So what I'm arguing for here, and putting world religions teaching, which is our subject of this institute, not just Islam, by the way, putting it into a frame that can carry it, and that can carry it along with all the other material it has to go with. Because what we're looking for, what we've done in the past, is we've piled new subjects on. We used to be kind of more or less happy with a Western civic course. You could get through it, it had a pattern, and then there was pressure, rightly so, to add all this stuff. But we have come up with an overburdened, additive kind of model for doing this. Well, what we need is an integrative model. And so I'm going to explore with you these three different models on which state standards are already based, on which university courses are already based, and we'll see how they work. And I won't pretend that I'm not making an argument for, which is brand X and Y, and which is, the new thing. So we're moving from a civilizations-based model to a human-centered global model. And most school systems would say that's what they would like to do. So there are basically three common models for teaching about the world that are out there in schools and universities. They have very long heritage, especially the first two. The first is the geographic perspective, the second, the civilizational perspective, and the third is the world history perspective, which is coming up. Now, what we have to understand about this is that each of them uses a different unit of organization. Again, this structural conversation you have not heard out in the press. You don't hear it too much when schools are trying to reform the way they do things, or restructure the curriculum, or bring in the Common Core and align it, or whatever it is. They don't talk about the structure of these courses. We talk about all the demands on it, and we enumerate them for you guys as teachers. But we don't talk about what is the vehicle that can carry all this weight of the skills and the, in critical thinking and da-da-da-da-da-da, to say nothing of all the content. So the geographic perspective is built on a unit of organization which used to be the continent, but today is a world region, usually a contemporary world region, like the Middle East, for example, Latin America. The civilizational perspective is built around a description of world civilization, a world civilization, one after another. It's a unit of organization kind of strung like pearls through the year. You study first this one and that. Well, first the emergence of civilizations, which is like the historical main event, right? When people settled and farmed and all that, and never mind, 100,000 years of history before that. But, now we're here, we're civilizations, and we're going to study a linear sequence of them, one after the other. The world history perspective is built around a different unit of organization, which is a series of eras considered across the globe. And we'll see how those work in detail. So the standalone geography course is the typical, the geography book. You start here, you go there. Sometimes they have a mini history sort of embedded in them, like each region of the world may have a little history, very badly connected to any other regions of the world, but nonetheless is kind of in there. These courses are sometimes students' first introduction to the world. It used to be the flagship world history course in 6th grade, kind of was the first introduction to the whole world after you went from the family, the community, the state, the nation, and so on. But in a lot of places now they have Eastern Hemisphere, Western Hemisphere courses, or something along those lines, or the 7th grade world geography course. So students basically in these courses are taken on a descriptive tour of the world. Facts upon facts upon facts. This river, that chain of mountains. It's gotten better because the geography standards, the national geography standards, based it around a series of themes and concepts much more than it used to be. So it's gotten better, but it's still a lot of stuff. But the most important thing about it is it's organized around a sequence of regions that are based on modern divisions of the world. And even the good people who put together the national geography standards realize that regions change over time. One of the main concepts in the geography set of skills is to understand that regions are created by people and they change over time. But the standalone geography course violates that right from out of the box, because it sets down modern regions as the unit that we're going to consider, never mind what regions might have been meaningful in past ages for one reason or another. And of course, it doesn't focus on the world as it was, it focuses on the world as it is, but how did it get here? We don't know. So it's very hard with this particular model to teach about his earlier regions or earlier historical events and connections. This is a kind of graphic description of what could be any world geography course, usually starting with Europe, and then sort of hopping from one silo to another. And when they're divided into Eastern Hemisphere, Western Hemisphere, you can sometimes find the odd course that puts Europe in the Western Hemisphere for some odd reason, because it's sort of the West. Not a lot do that, but I have seen some that do. And what happens in these courses, of course, is that students might get a sort of mini history of Europe, which might include some on the Mediterranean, but they won't study the Middle East until 3, 4, 5 months later. So they wouldn't have any sense of connections. The sort of problem with this kind of model for curriculum is it sends your students up and down manholes or lily pad jumping from one region to another without much connection between them. The second perspective, or the second model for teaching, is most common. It's got the longest history. It goes back to the 18th century and the 19th century early textbooks, in fact. And it organizes, in fact, its organization is at the core of almost every world history textbook for regular kids, not the AP. The AP have moved to the newer model. But they are organized around coverage of civilizations. Okay, the river valleys, yeah, that's kind of a globally considered frame, but after that it's Civ A, Civ B, Civ C. And so they're given chapter by chapter descriptions, starting with a description of the geographic setting, often never to see geography again in that chapter. The account of its origins, whether it's Romulus and Remus or Muhammad's biography or whatever. And then descriptions of political, usually the biggest part, social, cultural. And finally, at the end, a list of what we got from them, right? That's how they kind of ran it, and that has to be there. And then you put in civilizations, for example, that weren't formerly part of the curriculum, but you have to have this argument, unfortunately, whether they're really a civilization or not. And those have gotten ugly. Those discussions have gotten real ugly. And I've even seen world historians on listservs arguing about such things. But, the idea of to get in a course like this, only civilizations need apply. And so other regions that may not have anything to do with these questions being asked, often about empires rather than civilizations, have had a hard time getting both well integrated into the curriculum, A, and B, covered in a manner that is reflective of their importance in history. And of course, many areas were shut out. This is kind of the framework that is the core of the Old Western Civ course that you can see popping up here. These will be very familiar to many of you in the books that you've read. But then other things were added on: the River Valley civilizations, Islam, India, China, Byzantium and Russia, and Sub-Saharan Africa and the Americas. And then you see here, here's where more or less, now sometimes in later iterations, these have been covered multiple times. But the problem with them is that in this traditional sequence of Western civilizations, antecedents and progress through history, the others were sort of spliced in. Now they're spliced in sometimes 2, 3 times, but they're still spliced in. So after covering Rome, you then do sort of the medieval pageant of civilizations, China, India, all those glorious ones. And then often, just before the age of exploration, Sub-Saharan Africa and the Americas are taken way back to way early times and covered. By 1500, usually, the deck has been cleared for the rise of Europe. And then the colonized countries are covered kind of as a group, and then the developing countries, which unfortunately in the geography model are often divided that way by the developed countries and the not developed or underdeveloped or developing or NICs and whatever else there are out there. Now they call some of them pigs. My God, what a terrible word. The problem with this, and I've done tracking on this of the table of contents actually plotted onto a timeline. So you're throwing the students a couple thousand years back and forth at the beginning of the course until 1500. And then the decks are cleared, and it's kind of the small incremental movement of the study of Europe. And again, you sort of see these countries as a group. This model has suffered from the additive syndrome more than any other because nobody's satisfied with it. It slices the curriculum into smaller and smaller and smaller bits. Every time you add something, it means you've got less time for something else. So your coach is really unhappy. And again, it's not an integrative model at all. It was based on a corrective, which was sort of the multicultural movement, to add things that should have been represented, but it didn't do so in a manner that everybody actually complained. It wasn't elegant, it wasn't efficient, and it wasn't a really good narrative either. So other problems that there are with this particular model were that it started out as that was world history. And some of you may have seen that old timeline from like 1919 or something that shows that this was the subject of world history, what's in that red circle. Well, of course, by now, all these other circles have been added in, Mesoamerica and the Incas and so on, and West Africa, one of the latecomers, in some iterations, East Africa, the Middle East, you could make the circle larger or smaller, India, China, and Korea and Japan. And once in a while, Southeast Asia gets covered for a few minutes. But what's missing? The rest of the globe. It's like you bought Swiss cheese and ate the holes. So those areas, why? Because they weren't host to, the major appliances of the world history curriculum, which are the major civs. And so this model is really problematic, doesn't really admit to much more development, and in particular, because of this way that it's running linear coverage, it doesn't allow you to talk about the interactions among cultures. It doesn't sequence things that were happening in parallel very well. It drops whole important societies and then picks them up maybe later and maybe not.